Servus, willkommen in einem Fragens video. Welcome to yet another exciting video, in this case part 28 of my organisation series of videos. In this video, I will look at the estimated combat strengths of the armies which fought in 1800 and 1805. Beginning with 1800, in this analysis I'll be looking at the two main battles which occurred in this year, starting with the Battle of Marengo in June. Before I drill down into the combat strengths, let's just look at some of the rationale behind my thought processes in this video. The classic method of determining the combat strengths of opposing forces is to use the number of infantry, cavalry and artillery present on each side. This does give us a view of comparative strengths, but it does not take into account the specific troop quality and types and, of course, leadership. After all, it's a lot more expensive to field a cuirassier rather than a fusilier, for example. I would have had to have assumed some level of combat difference between the two units. In order to solve this issue of the detail necessary to really get a robust combat effectiveness of each side, I used a system that I recently did with World War II. I recently created a number of videos comparing the strengths of World War II and Cold War formations using a points system from a set of figure gaming rules. While this system is almost certainly not empirically foolproof, it does give us an idea of the difference in strength of opposing formations, which includes some aspect of troop type as well, increasing its accuracy. The point system that I'll be using for this video is an incredibly simple point system. It would be possible to use a more complex point system for using a more complex set of rules if you so desire. I went for the very simple system as it averages out a lot of the detail which I simply do not possess. While we have some data on the various orders of battle during the Napoleonic period, it's certainly not as accurate as World War II or Cold War, which I must admit is in itself subject to significant margins of error. So, establishing that I'm going to be using a point system from a figure gaming set of rules to determine the combat strengths of the opposing forces. Now, as my objective is to look at an entire battle, not at individual units, I'll look at each army by breaking down the level of command one level below army headquarters only. So, in this particular case for Marengo, and for the French, it's their rather early and small corps. As we move over to the Austrian army, the situation is a little bit more difficult, so I'll be going down to the wing level, which does give us a rather unequal breakdown of the army, as you can see here. In order to make it a little bit clearer for you to understand what the differences in strengths are, let's try and look at this data in a graphical form, as you can see here. The first point to note is that I can understand why Napoleon has such a difficult time at Marengo when I look at the comparative strengths here. Napoleon was a master at concentrating the maximum force against an enemy which lacked its maximum force. In this case, Napoleon was clearly outmaneuvered and found himself outnumbered, which explains the initial loss and is quite unusual for Napoleon, unless of course we go to 1814, which is a different kettle of fish. On the other hand, where Napoleon really did shine was the recovery. The recovery was impressive, and it does indicate the French had a command or leadership force multiplier over the Austrians at an operational and tactical level at least. The other interesting point was the lopsided nature of the Austrian army, which with the centre comprising of well over 50% of the entire combat strength of the army. This may have been a factor in the slow deployment of the Austrian attack, which, if it was launched more effectively and quicker, may well have swept the French forces from the field before the other corps came up to support the initial corps that was impacted by the Austrians. Based on this analysis, command clearly was a critical factor in this battle, as the French had lost the first part of the battle and its ability to recover was what secured it victory. This had to be due to superior command control. The other factor was superior corps level command, as the French, which outnumbered, at least in the initial stages of the battle, did manage to hold the Austrians back until sufficient reinforcements arrived to ensure they weren't swept from the field. I'm uncertain if tactically the French were superior in this battle. I suspect some formations may have been, but but I suspect in this case command was the critical factor for the French victory, not individual troop quality. Let's now move to the Battle of Hohenlinden, which occurred in December of 1800. Hohenlinden was a much larger battle than Marengo. This shows the entire French force. However, in this case, one of the wings, the right wing, was not available during the battle and will not be included in the graphical view of the force comparison. When we move over to the Austrians were organised into 4 main columns, which, surprise, surprise, advanced in 4 separate columns. 2 were on good roads and 2 on poor roads, which did have a major impact on how the battle unfolded. Let's now look at the graphical representation of the force comparison. Once we remove the French right wing, both forces were very evenly matched. The flow and result of the battle was very much a result of the Austrians being surprised at the French defending and a brilliant outflanking manoeuvre on the French right flank. The piecemeal engagement of the Austrian forces also assisted in their defeat. Due to the size of the French army, it was also organised into what was normally called wings. However, below the wing structure, the French did use the same early small corps structure that the French used at Marengo. Well, on the Austrian side, the 2 largest columns did engage the French quickly on the Austrian right flank and the Austrian centre, as they were travelling on good quality roads. This was critical as the weather was poor at this time, leaving many roads very muddy. Apart from the Austrians being surprised, the other major issue the Austrians faced were the 2 smaller columns arrived very late, and in both cases, once they met the French, broke up into small units which were easily brushed aside by the French, which had adopted a much more concentrated posture. This was clearly a command failure on the Austrian side, at least for the 2 small columns, as well as a single commander on the French side displaying an extraordinary level of initiative, allowing the French to outflank the Austrians. Once again, I feel we can say there was a definite difference in command at a strategic level, with the Austrians being strategically surprised. The other interesting point was the impressive local initiative of some of the French commanders, which was generally lacking or inferior on the Austrian side. I must admit, the Austrian right flank did show significant initiative, but that was the exception rather than the rule. When all factors were equalled out, the Austrian infantry were generally evenly matched with the French, but too often they were placed in an impossible position and suffered accordingly. Let's now shoot forward to 1805, specific the series of battles which resulted in the Austrian disaster at Ulm in mid-October. One thing that you can quickly see here is that the armies have grown a lot in the short 5 years between 1800 and 1805. You can really see this when you look at the French army, which is orders of magnitude larger than even the largest army in 1805. The Austrian army, shown here in its totality, was equally huge, although this does include the army of Italy, which will be removed from our strength comparisons of the Battle of Ulm. The first interesting point is both forces seem very evenly matched. However, the Austrians were much more scattered. The Tyrolean column was not involved for most of the critical parts of the campaign, and many other columns were spending their time advancing west to only then reverse back, seeing very little action until it was too late. Most of the fighting was performed by only a single column before the Austrians found themselves surrounded and effectively defeated. Looking at the French side, we can see the French had adopted their new corps structure, with each corps being strong enough to hold out against a larger force if required. This may well have been another critical factor in the French success, or at least in their strategic mobility, as each corps could easily move in a coordinated manner independently of all the other corps, and then much easily concentrated when required, which is exactly what occurred during this battle. On the other hand, the Austrians adopted the column structure, and on the surface this appeared very similar to the French corps system. However, the subordinate formations within each column were often unfamiliar with each other, and with the exception of the Tyrolean column, and perhaps the other smallest column, coordination was lacking when compared with the French. It could simply not operationally or strategically move in the same way as the French. It was simply not coordinated and not coherent enough in order to do so. Considering the outcome of this battle and the theoretical force mix, which was basically pretty even, this is a clear example of superior strategic command as well as superior operational command on the French side. The interesting point about this campaign was the poor showing of the Austrians when they did attempt to counterattack. This could indicate the French infantry in particular were beginning to achieve some level of superiority over the Austrians, which they may not have possessed in 1800. I also suspect part of the reason why the Austrians were unable to achieve anything during their counterattack was once again mainly due to command and the fact that when the commanders went into battle, they often commanded subordinate formations that they were unfamiliar with, which always causes problems in terms of when there's a crisis or moving rapidly. Let's now move forward to the Battle of Caldera, which occurred in late October, just after the surrender at Ulm. The Battle of Caldera is of great interest to me due to the differences in strengths of both sides. When we actually look at the French structure, you can see the French maintained something closer to their old column structure, although there were some level of corps below this. When we move over to the Austrians, we can see that in this case they were organised into wings rather than columns. I'm not 100% certain what the real difference is. I suspect wings are a lot more coherent than a column, but nonetheless there were a lot more wings here than there were columns in the much larger army further north. The first thing we need to do is strip away the forces which were not involved directly in this battle. Thus, we can see the opposing forces were actually reasonably equal, even though if you look at the order of battle earlier, the Austrians outnumbered the French in totality significantly. What I find interesting in this case is the Austrians did possess significantly more forces, but these were not involved in the battle. It seems like this is an example of Austrians' formations wandering around unengaged while other formations are forced to fight at a disadvantage. Once again, this could be a command issue, or it could even be a doctrinal issue, or perhaps even a structural issue, the lack of a mobile corps system on the Austrian side. On the other hand, even if we ignore the fact that the Austrians were outmanoeuvred on a strategic level, while both forces were evenly matched, the French managed to force the Austrians back nonetheless, which is nonetheless a surprise. Particularly they did so over a river. I suspect part of this was due to Charles, the commander of the Austrians, wishing to fall back to Vienna after hearing of Mac's surrender. But with the forces available, you would have thought Charles would have had the ability to engage the French and defeat them rapidly. On the other hand, Charles may have realised the victory in Italy was not going to make up for the loss in Germany and probably wisely withdrew. Now we come to the final battle in 1805, the decisive Battle of Austerlitz, which occurred in December. This shows the French army. In terms of strength, the French had reduced significantly, possibly due to losses and the requirement of garrisoning conquered territory. But it is a significant reduction, almost half of the forces that Napoleon commanded at the beginning of the Battle of Ulm. On the other hand, the Allied army had a significant advantage in terms of raw strength over the French, primarily because the Russian army had joined up with the survivors of the Austrians, and the result was a significantly larger force mix. Looking at this comparison of forces, we can see now why Austerlitz was such a brilliant victory. The French should have lost this, yet they managed to shatter the Allied army. Of all the battles that we've currently sort of outlined, this is the only one where one side has a significant advantage over the other. One factor for this victory on the French side was the excellent performance of the French right flank, which managed to hold against very heavy and superior attacks. I suspect by 1805 the French infantry had achieved a moderate level of superiority over the Austrian infantry, at least. Possibly it only applied to Devant's corps, because Devant seemed to be the commander of the corps which performed the best in terms of defence. I'm uncertain, but some level of superiority had occurred. However, apart from this possible superiority, at least against the Austrians, the French may have had, at least in one corps, it's clearly the main reason for the French victory was leadership, or the leadership of Napoleon. Outnumbered, he managed to surprise, cut through and surround half the Allied army. I tend to view this battle as Napoleon's pinnacle, and it was an astounding achievement. And so we come to an end of my part 28 of my organisational video series, in this case looking at the strengths of the army which fought in 1800 and 1805. I mean, one reason why I'm trying to do this is trying to analyse or understand the impact of command in victories and defeats. Once we can actually look at the raw combat power, and just note the point system that I'm using does factor in some quality aspects. So Napoleon's guards clearly have a greater combat capacity than, let's say, the Austrian Landwehr or something of this nature. So there is some quantitative modification involved in the force mix. So it's a much better measure of the raw combat strength of both sides than, let's say, just looking at manpower or cavalry or artillery. Nonetheless, we can see now that most of these battles were fairly evenly matched, and the French won all of them. And in one of them, the French were significantly outnumbered and still won possibly their greatest victory. So we can really clearly see that leadership, doctrine, and also the structure of the various formations had a significant impact in whether or not an army was going to win or lose. Alle guten Dinge kommen zu einem Ende.